Rich Hull, we went from what's it called? American Psycho to the American Fighting Spirit with this one.
That's right. Nothing but super American stories.
Well, congratulations on this documentary. I saw it last year at the Newport Beach Film Festival with Justin D. Roberts, who is your co-director and co-writer on this project. How did this all come about for you guys? Because I know Justin was a retired chaplain and you're a film producer. And here we are with this incredible documentary about a chaplain whose remains were still over in Southeast Asia that are finally coming back home to the United States.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you got to see it at Newport. That was one of just a couple previews that we did of unfinished version of the film. And we did one at Fort Knox. We did one, which is, by the way, really cool. Turns out there's a lot of cool stuff at Fort Knox. Um, we did one at the Museum of Tolerance in LA. But we wanted to just sort of give audiences a preview of what it was that we were building, and we had that opportunity at Newport, which we specifically chose because it's so close to so many military members down in kind of the San Diego area, and so it was a really special screening. And so then we kind of like went silent for a while and finished the film, and then we came back. And you're right, my partner Justin Roberts. By the way, I'm biased here, but I think we assembled a great team. Justin being part of that team, and Justin is a former Army combat chaplain who had left the military, wanted to get into filmmaking. He made a movie, and we ended up connecting. I have, as you pointed out, this is I think my 28th movie as a film producer, but my first as a director, and I luckily had Justin alongside me because I am not a veteran. And my dad's a veteran. I have a lot of veterans in my family, but Justin's a veteran. And so I really wanted somebody who could kind of view the stories that we were telling through a veteran lens to make sure that we were telling them with, complete authenticity. And then of course Justin found himself in front of the camera sort of unexpectedly on this film. And I got involved in the film 4 years ago. I had made a documentary as a producer years ago with Halle Berry. She and I had it was about black soldiers that had fought in all the U.S. wars we ever had. It was with the Army, and we won the NAACP Image Award and some other interesting awards. And the company that decided that they wanted to make this movie in the first place about military chaplains 4 years ago is called Paulus Productions. They're based in Los Angeles. They are a nonprofit. They were formed 60 years ago by a Catholic priest. And because of my association with that past project that Hallie and I did, they said, "Oh, you're probably the guy to help us get the attention of the military that you really kind of need if you're going to make a movie like this." And so I did, and I had a lot of trust with the military, and I think that that was, helpful in that. And then somewhere along the way, I decided to step in and direct it, and it was my first movie as a director. So it kind of allowed me to do something really fresh and unique, and ultimately the reason to do that was I had no idea that chaplains even existed as a profession, and so I started learning about it. And I thought, wow, this is a peek into a world I'd never even heard of. And, if you think about it, chaplains go to war wearing a uniform but carrying no weapon. And you're like, who does that? Like, why in the world would you ever do that? That's so bizarre. And obviously, we know that it's motivated by something far larger that we probably can't even put into words. It's not a job you do for the paycheck, it's a real calling. And I thought something with that kind of motivation set against kind of the chaos of war is just a world and two worlds colliding that we had never seen before cinematically. And so I just couldn't stop doing it. And then I Justin became involved, and then I had remembered Jeff Strucker, who was a former Army chaplain who had been portrayed in the movie Black Hawk Down, and he became involved, and then Chris Pratt became involved, and this checks a lot of boxes for Chris because he's a very military supporting guy, and he's very faith forward, and one of the biggest movie stars in the world, and he's got a big voice and a big platform, and like it just kept snowballing, and pretty soon, here we are.
Well, you made a fantastic documentary. Have we found out if Chaplain Emile, whose remains have returned, has been canonized as a saint, or are we still waiting on that?
We're still waiting, as you know, probably the Vatican moves at a glacial pace. And so but it's still in the system, right? It's still kind of working its way through the system. And one of these days, the Pope may just decide this is the day and will announce it as so. And what's so interesting about Father Capon's story is that we never intended to tell his story at all. We had gone and we had shot all these interviews with current military chaplains, former chaplains like Justin, uh, chief of chaplains of every branch of the military, senior leadership from the military. And that's the movie that we were going to create. And so we're sitting in the edit room, we're cutting these stories together, and the movie was really having a hard time finding its voice. And then we looked up one day and Father Emile Capon's remains were identified 70 years after his death in a Korean prisoner of war camp. And so they decided that they would repatriate them, bring them back to the US, bury them in his hometown of Wichita, Kansas, have a funeral for him. And if you know anything about, the Catholic Church on one hand and the military on the other hand, they know how to put on a show. And so we decided, well, okay, let's take Justin, who was kind of going through some of his own struggles, kind of post-military, trying to figure out what he was going to do next in his life. And we sent him over to Wichita. We sent a camera crew with him. We just said, just go shoot whatever, is happening there. And we didn't quite know if it was going to fit in, but we just kind of felt like it would. And I think Justin probably thought he was going to be like the only guy there. But of course, when he got there, it like basically was an event that had closed down the entire city and people had come from far and wide to celebrate not just this former chaplain, but also all chaplains. And I think that was a very powerful journey for Justin to be on that really kind of changed the direction of his life. And you notice the word journey is kind of in the title of the movie. And so journey is, I think, probably an important theme here because there's a lot of journeys. Justin has his journey. I kind of had a journey learning about this world. Father Capon had his own journey. Some of the other chaplains that inspired Justin's journey have their own journey. So there's a lot of journeyness in this film. But the irony is just simply that, you know, you make a plan for a documentary and kind of the only thing you know is that the plan's going to be wrong. And just that event was like the universe's way of telling us to take this like complete left turn in the film. And I think it's where it found its heartbeat, quite frankly. Justin became kind of the tour guide for the audience through all these stories on his way to the Father Capon funeral. And I just think that's kind of what made it all tie together.
And there is a couple of other chaplain stories in there that are really touching. The three chaplains of the three different two faiths and two faiths and two different denominations: a rabbi, a priest, and a minister, which is the setup for 90% of jokes that are hacky. And yet we have these three men who literally went down with the ship, these Navy chaplain that have a chapel in their honor.
You're right, and you're off by one, so it's four chaplains, and
thank you so much.
They math is not my strong suit either, so I can relate. No, they have this incredible museum, and one of the ways we were able to demonstrate that in the movie is we found this old footage of Frank Sinatra talking about this Four Chaplains Museum. And it became kind of the perfect lead in to explain what it is that they had done, who they were, what the significance of them is. And you're right, these guys were on a ship in World War II and it started going down and they were out of life vests. And so they started handing out their life vests, knowing that it was going to be certain death for them. And it was. And that resulted in a lot of saved lives. And so in the film, when you hear the stories firsthand of some of the survivors who are, in their 80s now, talking about their interaction with the four chaplains and how the life vest saved their life, there's not a dry eye in the house. Like even in the interviews, like these guys were just so emotional about what was such just a moment in time event. And that's the thing that I think is so interesting here, at least for me. 100% of the veterans I've ever met in my life through this whole experience, they all have a story about a chaplain. And maybe it's just a moment where the chaplain had a tiny little influence on their life, or maybe it's something like the four chaplains where it saved their life. But they all have it. I mean, chaplains are revered in the military. And I think, the challenge with that is that most Americans don't know that they exist because chaplains don't like being part of the story. And so we had to like drag these stories out of these guys because they want to point the spotlight at the soldiers who they view as the real heroes. And that's what's so neat about this is bringing these untold stories that have never been told before. I mean, the Four Chaplains may be one of the few that has ever made its way into kind of the general population, but for the most part, these have been kind of part of a very closed community, and now we're bringing that into the world at a really, I think, important time. I mean, the movie comes out November 8th. It's a Friday. It's the first day of the Veterans Day weekend, and it's coming out in theaters and only in theaters, not on streaming. And we of course, wanted to tie in and celebrate the Veterans Day weekend, but also it's just a few days after the US presidential election. And we thought, man, wouldn't it be cool if people of all kind of persuasions and beliefs could kind of come into a movie theater and join their community together and find some common ground to agree on at, a time when we probably need a little bit of healing as Americans. And who can't agree on the incredible role of combat chaplains? And so we've noticed that as we've kind of gone through these advanced screenings of the movie over the last couple months leading up to the theatrical release date, that like the lights come up and the audiences are so moved. And for me as a filmmaker, it's just so powerful. Um and I think it's different types of audiences. I think the military audiences, people that are either in the military, were in the military, part of a family that had a connection to the military, I think that kind of triggers an emotional response about their experience in the military. But then by the end of the movie, these are like tears of joy because they're like, oh my gosh, this has given voice to my experience in a way that maybe I wasn't able to do. And now I can explain to my family, my friends, and the world kind of what my experience was like. And I think there's a big element of faith-based audiences finding something really special in it. I think it's kind of one of the few opportunities I can think of where you really do get a chance to kind of like live out your faith every single day. And so I think that they find something interesting in that. General audiences like me are just finding like the peek into this like world that you didn't even know existed is super interesting. And I'm biased when I say this, but I think they respond to the storytelling as well. And so it's been a really interesting journey. And the screening started, by the way, at the Pope's house. And as it turns out, the Pope has a screening room in his house. And it's small. It was built in 900 AD. It's an old chapel. If it were a screening room in LA, nobody would go to it. The sound quality is horrible and echoes, and it's in the Pope's house. And so the Vatican City has its own like theater system and stuff, but the screening room that's in the Pope's compound is kind of reserved for very special occasions. And the people that have been invited to screen their movies there are kind of the household names of our industry, Martin Scorsese and so forth. And to include us on that list, I mean, it made my Catholic mother very happy, but it was just a very powerful experience for all of us to go over and pass through the Swiss Guard and go into the Pope's compound and, sit in his screening room. It was an incredible experience. And it really, I think, kicked us off in the right direction on these advanced screenings, kind of leading up to the theatrical release.
Wow. And there is another chaplain in the documentary. Forgive me if I forgot his name. I believe it was Chaplain Cleveland. He was the African-American chaplain that was in the Civil War. And here is a war being fought for his people's freedom within his own country that he's still considered at the time 3/5 of a human being. And he's that righteous of a man to be a military chaplain. And as you mentioned earlier, military chaplains, at the most they'd ever have as a weapon would be a utility knife to just cut something and a flashlight. Even translators have a sidearm. So this is a man who's 3/5 of a person at the time, full man, but by law was considered 3/5 of a human being, going in unarmed into these battles.
Isn't that nuts? I mean, his name was Garland White,
Garland
and
White, thank you so much.
yeah, and look, we really wanted to tell a diverse group of stories because that's one of the things that makes the Chaplain score so interesting to me is that it is truly diverse. It is men, it is women, it is people of all ethnicities and people of all religions. And all religions you can think of are represented there. Christian, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, you name it. And we tried to feature as many of them as we could in order to show the diversity. But also we wanted to, tell a bunch of historical stories of not just white men, but also a bunch of other types of diverse chaplains. And Garland White is one of those stories that I just thought was so powerful. And you're right, he did. He went and he fought for freedoms he didn't necessarily enjoy at home. He recruited people into the military. He provided support to the soldiers. He had played such an important role in our nation's history that he ultimately wound up standing alongside President Abraham Lincoln. It's just one of those stories that has never been told before and deserves to be told. It's just indicative of all the chaplain stories. There's been 419 chaplains that have died throughout American history and for their service and like in service. And chaplains were started by George Washington. So that means every single US battle we've ever had, there's been a chaplain there. And, Garland White was there. And we just loved his story so much that we wanted to highlight it.
The heartbreaking thing is we know very little about Chaplain Garland White. This is the first I had ever heard of him was in your documentary with Fighting Spirit. And here we are, like, what is 150 plus years, and people are only now discovering him, if we're lucky, rediscovering him. Has there been thought since you produced 29 other films to do a biopic on him, or are there books about him that we can read? Because I knew nothing about him until your film.
Well, we knew nothing about him either. We sort of stumbled upon it. And the way we did is we found a letter that he had written to his wife. And that kind of started our journey into his story. And then it's like an onion. You start to peel back the layers of the onion. And we found that there were soldiers that didn't know how to read and write. And so before they went into battle, they would ask him, who did, to write letters back to their loved ones in case they never came back. And so through that, we got to actually kind of like hear his story in his own words in a strange way. But finding historical information about him turned out to be very difficult for the reason that you're pointing out. Like his story has just not gotten told. I would love to make his story. I really would. And I'd love to just dig deeper and deeper and into it. We even had a hard time. If you notice in the film, we show a statue of him. We show pictures of everybody else whose story we told. We couldn't find a picture of him. Now, obviously, they didn't. Not everybody was walking around with an iPhone back then. But we were able to find a statue of him. So even that part of him, the visual part of him, is not terribly well represented. And so, but that's the joy that I think we get by bringing these stories that nobody's ever heard. We even found one, interestingly enough, there is a guy named Tom Soljan who's in the film. He's the former chief of chaplains for the Army. And we interviewed him and we expected to use him to, help us narrate some of the historical stories that we would tell. Well, between takes, he started telling this story about something that happened to him in Iraq, where he took off all of his gear and he walked into the middle of a battle and everyone stopped shooting. And it ended up saving countless lives by doing that and putting his own life at risk, which is crazy. And luckily, the camera was rolling and we got that and never intended to tell that story. And, that's a story nobody would know except for this movie. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities to tell stories about these types of people that just, we've just barely scratched the surface, I think. So, yeah, I want to come back. I want to make movies about all of them.
No, because what you're telling me, it also reminds me of a situation that happened in 2014 in Ukraine when the first go around of the uprising between the Russians and the Ukrainians was happening, and an Orthodox priest came in with a giant cross and just planted it in the middle of the street, and that was his marker of no, there's not going to be anything happening here today. And just three priests end up in the middle of the street doing that. So it's very interesting to see, how important chaplains are. Yet we've seemed to either of their own volition not want to be recognized, or as a society that's become more secular has kind of pushed the notion of being a chaplain out of the way.
Well, I think that's part of the takeaway from the movie is that, one person can make a difference. And it may be small, it may be medium, it may be big. But one person can make a difference. It's just like what you described in Ukraine. One guy walking out and planting that cross in the middle of the street and having everything settle down because of it. And I think you can take that and kind of apply it to your life. And one of the ways that you can do that, I think, is kind of a call to action that the movie gives you, which is to like check on your veteran friends. I think there's someone in the movie says you go to war and you come back a very different person, and you wind up with these, as they say, scars on your soul, which I think is such a powerful phrase. And you may come back and you may be a better person, you're going to be different. And so I think for us as Americans here, we all know veterans. We all know people that have been at war. Picking up the phone, calling them, checking in, how you doing? Let me tell you how I feel about you. Like those are important little moments that we can do. And if the film teaches us anything, it's that. And so particularly with Veterans Day coming up, I mean, it's not like you need a better excuse than that. That makes it pretty easy, especially if your call to action is, hey, let's go watch this movie. That's even better. But no, I think that's really, I really think that's what it is. At least for me, it's that just one person can make such a big difference.
All right. So you've made this documentary. We go back 200 plus 250 years almost of US history. And we sit there and we have our chaplains and we have our domestic wars and we have our foreign wars. Yet what I continue to notice, and as unpopular of a war as it was with Vietnam, how do we recognize the survivors that are still here of the Vietnam War and pay homage to them? And how do we do that with the chaplains of that era and, make sure that they're okay as well? Because it seems like, the greatest generation, the silent generation, and the wars that they fought, and for those that are still around, and then Korea, they're recognized, and Desert Storm, and then, the second Iraq War and Afghanistan. Everyone's recognized except our veterans from Vietnam.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. I do. I think that's something that we have to do better with as a nation. And, some of those guys are getting up there in years, so we don't have there's an urgency to it. And I think one of the things that I thought was interesting about the film is that the story we chose to tell about Vietnam was a story of a chaplain who kind of became like the conscience of the military almost. He said, hey, I think some of the things that we're doing are ethically wrong. And that actually caused a shift in direction in the military. And so, obviously I think that had positive impact on people's lives. And so I do think it's odd that we are not fully embracing the soldiers of that generation, the chaplains of that generation, the people who served in a really big way. I live in Los Angeles. I'm not too far from the Veterans Administration Hospital in Westwood. And, you see a lot of people who are Vietnam veterans in and around that area that need support. And I know that the military is working to improve that, and as they should. But I think we as citizens can do our part too. And I think you're seeing chaplains kind of do a part in that as well. Like, I think intuitively you would think that the leading cause of death in the military is probably getting shot at war. Well, it's not. And so, suicide is a big problem, giant problem. And the chaplains are the ones that have said, we're going to tackle that, and they are, and they're making a difference, a positive difference, and that includes both soldiers who are currently at war, but also soldiers that come home from war. And so that's the great thing about chaplains is chaplains are working with families that are here at home. They're working on military bases. They're working at hospitals. Now, combat chaplains are like the tip of the spear. They're the ones that go out there and they're dealing with soldiers of all faiths and no faith, and they're dealing with very life and death questions, and bullets are flying by, and there's a lot of adrenaline and action there. But then there's a lot of stuff that happens when those soldiers come home, and so the chaplains are still working on that as well. But I agree. I think we as citizens have to do better to support those people who served us.
It's perfect timing that we're revisiting this, because when I talked to Justin, it was just past Veterans Day, the first go around. And now we're talking on All Saints Day leading up to Veterans Day for the official release of Fighting Spirit. So this all comes full circle 1 year later.
It really does. These things take forever. I mean, it really does demonstrate that it's a labor of love because, I think just finishing year 4 of this. And so it takes a while. The wheels of Hollywood turn very slowly, for better, for worse, especially in the documentary world. And so you're right. It's been a long journey. And I'm so glad you got to see it in theaters. I'm so glad that you got to meet Justin in person. And obviously Justin's gone on, since you saw him last time, and is really, I think, after the Father Capon funeral experience, I think really found something that makes him happy. And I won't give that away because we allude to it at the end of our film. And that's really Justin's story to tell after the film leaves off. But man, I really think that everybody's lives are just a little bit better by being involved in this movie.
As things progress, and congratulations on the official release, and it's going to be in theaters. And what people didn't specify, or at least I should have specified earlier, forgive me, you had one screening at Newport Beach that led to 3. So the response here, at least in Orange County, was the fact that it blew up in the fact that, oh, the interest was already there. What's it like when you are at a film festival and you're scheduled for one screening, and then the response is so good that the festival is forced to add 2 more in how much the people want to see your film?
Well, look, it's an honor. It's our job as filmmakers to touch people's emotion. They could come out of the movie and say, I love it. And then somebody else next to them says, I hated it. And they get in an argument or a discussion about it. And I feel like, okay, victory. And so the fact that people are just feeling something, I think that's the real magical part of this. And it's interesting because it's taken so long, as you point out. It's been since those previews, it's been a while since I've seen the movie in a theater with audiences. And so then over the last couple months, as we've done these screenings leading up to the November 8th theatrical release, it's reminded me of how the movie plays in a room with people, and it's really powerful. And so that part of it is really powerful for me too. And so I love it. It's kind of the movie that needs to be seen in the theaters because it needs to be enjoyed with a group. And I think it causes discussions afterwards. It's funny, at all of the screenings we go to, we can't get the audiences out of the theaters. Like there's always something happening in that theater afterwards, but everybody's just standing around talking and debating and discussing. And like, that's so awesome, as a filmmaker, just to move people to discussion and inspire them. And I think that's the part that's been so special for me.
Well, I want to congratulate you on this documentary. I'm glad I got to speak with you, and I got to know Justin as well. The website is fightingspiritfilm.com in association with Paulist Productions, which is paulistproductions.org. Where can we also find you on social media if we want to continue the conversation with you following Veterans Day and the release of the film?
I'm at all the usual places. You can look me up. It's Rich Hull, Hull, and LinkedIn and Instagram and all that sort of stuff. Um, and I notice I've gotten a lot more attention on Instagram since Chris Pratt has started posting about the movie on Instagram because the guy's got 50 million Instagram followers. And so it is really amplified, I think, so much of what we're doing with the movie. But that's the best place to find me, but also through the fightingspiritfilm.com website where you can go and you can type in your zip code, you can find a theater near you. And, the nature of the theatrical exhibition business is that it's kind of a last minute business. And so we'll be adding theaters more and more and more the closer it gets. So even if you don't see one at a theater right next to you, like, you can go a couple days later and there will be more theaters and hopefully there will be one close to you because it's going to roll out, nationwide in all the big markets. And so we're really excited about it. And you can always track me down that way.
Richard Hull, it's been a great pleasure chatting with you. Fighting Spirit, A Chaplain's Journey, fightingspiritfilm.com, an incredible documentary. I'm revisiting it 1 year later, and I'm still getting goosebumps talking about it. Congratulations. Hopefully we get a film or at least a biography on Chaplain White, and then we'll go from there.
I love it. Thanks so much for having me.